What if everything you think you know about ancient pagan civilizations is only half the truth? For thousands of years, legends, religious writings, and archaeological discoveries have painted conflicting images of humanity's earliest cultures. Some depict them as enlightened societies with sophisticated astronomy, art, and governance. Others describe them as violent, morally corrupted peoples who engaged in horrifying rituals, including human sacrifice, ritualized sexual acts, temple prostitution, and practices strictly condemned by later religions, especially in the Bible. In this story, we embark on a 24,000-word journey that investigates a provocative question. Were ancient idol-worshipping civilizations truly as dark, brutal, and morally chaotic as some texts claim? Or were they simply misunderstood through the lens of later moral systems? Through a blend of historical research, archaeological evidence, and narrative exploration, we will travel across Mesopotamia, Canaan, Egypt, Mesoamerica, and the Mediterranean world. We will witness their rituals, understand their worldviews, and explore whether practices like human sacrifice, ritual sexual acts, incest within royal bloodlines, murder and violent rites, theft, slavery, and conquest were genuinely a defining part of those societies, or exaggerated by later writers to warn their own people from following the same paths. This story is designed to hold your attention from the beginning with a gripping hook, strong pacing, and rich historical scenes. Now, let us step into the fire-lit world of the ancient past. Hello. Welcome to my channel. Before we start, it's a good idea to go to bed and relax. I also want to ask you to subscribe to my channel, like it and write in the comments where you are from and what time it is. Using the link in the description you can support me. Thank you. Sweet dreams. The first thing you would notice is the noise. Not a scream, not a chant, but a steady, rhythmic roar, like a living creature exhaling from the earth itself. The fire pit at the center of the Canaanite high place burned day and night, fed by priests who believed flame was the closest thing humans could touch of the divine. No idol stood here yet. Only the fire. Only the heat. To an outsider arriving from the future, the scene would look brutal and haunting, a circle of standing stones, the smell of burned resin and animal blood, worshippers bowing low before the flames. Yet to the people of this age, this was simply life. This was devotion. And this is where our journey begins, not with judgments, but with immersion. Around 1500 BCE, many cultures across the ancient Near East worshipped deities believed to control fertility, harvest, storms, and war. People depended on unstable seasons, unpredictable weather, and fragile crops. Their religions were reflections of fear, hope, and survival. But intertwined with this were rituals that would later strike the world as unthinkable. A young priest named Amikar tended the fire that morning. His arms were painted with spirals of red ochre, a symbol of the life force his people believed flowed through both humans and gods. He carried a bronze bowl of barley and incense, stepping in rhythm to the slow beat of the drums. Behind him, carved into stone, stood the half-finished idol, a bull-headed figure meant to represent a deity of power and virility. To complete it was to complete a pact with their god. And with that pact came obligations. The villagers gathered, whispering. Today's ceremony was spoken of for weeks. A drought had crushed their harvests, the river had shrunk into a narrow thread of mud. In their minds, the gods were angry. Something had been withheld. Something must be given. Amikar felt the pressure heavy on his shoulders. He had been raised on stories of ancient rituals, of offerings that sealed divine favor. Most were animals, grain, or wine. But sometimes more was demanded. Stories of older times told of children passed through fire, of kings who shed their own blood, of women sent to sacred tents for rites they could not refuse. Were these legends? Or memories? Even the priests weren't sure. Amikar stepped toward the fire, lifted the bowl, and let the incense fall into the flames. A column of fragrant smoke rose instantly, twisting into the morning sky. The crowd murmured with reverence. But at the edge of the gathering, a traveler watched with different eyes. Her name was Sarai, a woman from a tribe that worshipped one invisible god, a deity without image, without altar, without the rituals that dominated the lives of neighboring peoples. She had spent months traveling through pagan lands, studying their customs, trying to understand why her own tradition so fiercely warned against them. What she saw today was both familiar and foreign, human longing, human fear, human devotion, expressed through practices her faith condemned. As the crowd stepped back, the chieftain approached the fire carrying a goat with gilded horns. A simple sacrifice. A safe one. But the murmurs spoke of a different fear. Would this be enough? Sarai's heart tightened. She sensed tension in the air. The kind that precedes a turning point in history. This morning, she was about to witness something that would shape her understanding of ancient civilizations forever. The goat kicked weakly in the chieftain's arms, sensing the tension, smelling the fire. The villagers stepped back in a silent ripple as he approached the stone altar. His face was painted black with ash, forming the shape of a crescent moon, a mark of authority and responsibility. Responsibility. That was the burden no one envied today. Amikar watched him carefully. The two men had known each other since childhood, before either understood the heavy rules of the gods they served. Now they stood on opposite ends of fear and expectation. The drought had lasted 7 moons. Children coughed through dust-filled nights. Women scraped the earth for roots that no longer grew. Even the animals wandered restlessly, their ribs visible beneath thinning hides. The villagers believed the gods had turned their backs. And they believed sacrifices, even terrible ones, could turn divine faces toward them again. The goat's throat was cut quickly. Cleanly. A necessary act. Blood spilled into a carved channel that led straight into the fire pit. The flames flared as if drinking. Some people gasped. Some bowed their heads. But deep inside, an unspoken thought trembled. What if the gods demanded more? Sarai felt the collective fear like a pulse under the ground. She had seen sacrifices in other lands, grain, animals, wine. Offerings of devotion, not desperation. But here, she sensed the edge of something darker. Something that could push humans into acts they would never commit under any other circumstances. A woman beside her whispered, "The goat is not enough. Moloch demands a life." Sarai's heart tightened. She turned to study the woman, thin, exhausted, eyes sunken from months of famine. Was this belief? Or despair disguised as devotion? Before she could speak, a sudden gust of wind swept across the high place, sending sparks spiraling upward. The crowd murmured and shifted uneasily. Some saw this as a sign of acceptance. Others as a warning. Amikar's hands trembled slightly as he stepped closer to the chieftain. "Father," he said in a low voice meant only for him. But whispers travel easily in fear. "Not today," Amikar continued. "The goat is enough. It must be enough." The chieftain stared into the fire, jaw clenched. His silence said more than words ever could. The council had debated this for days. Elders muttered about ancient rites, about the firstborn offering once practiced in forgotten generations. They spoke of reviving what had been abandoned. And the villagers, some were terrified. Others were ready. Sarai forced herself to breathe slowly. She had come here to witness, not to intervene. But watching a people wrestle with such choices made her question her resolve. What drove civilizations to such extremes? Was it faith? Or the crushing weight of survival? Were ancient rites born from cruelty, or from desperation? Sarai had learned during her travels that ancient religions were not as simple as modern minds imagined. They were mixtures of fear, awe, misunderstanding of nature, and the human need to control the uncontrollable. But even so, some rituals crossed lines she couldn't ignore. Amikar turned to face the crowd. "The gods are honored," he said, forcing strength into his voice. "They have received the lifeblood of the herd. They will not forget us. Some nodded, relieved. Others looked unconvinced. Then a voice called out, old, cracked, relentless. And who will give the life of the firstborn? Silence. The kind of silence that steals the air. The speaker was Elder Namer, a man whose memories reached farther back than anyone else's. His skin hung loose on brittle bones, his eyes burned with fanatic certainty. He leaned on a crooked staff carved with ancient symbols. It was once known, he said, sweeping the crowd with his gaze, that when famine struck and rivers dried, the gods required a greater gift. A child of the people, offered to seal the covenant. Gasps. Cries. A few nodded in grim agreement. Amikar's face paled. Sarai felt her stomach twist. This was the very ritual her own scriptures warned against. This was the line her ancestors refused to cross. This was the moment cultures diverged, some turning toward compassion, others toward fear-driven extremes. The chieftain stepped forward, raising his hands. "We will discuss this in council," he said. "No decision will be made today." But the crowd was already fracturing, hope clashing with terror, tradition with modern sensibilities, faith with the instinct to protect one's own child. Sarai stepped back, her mind racing. If the council agreed with Elder Namer, a life would be taken. A life offered not out of cruelty, but from a belief that had shaped civilizations for thousands of years. Her journey through ancient lands had brought her close to many dark rituals, but this one was different. This was human sacrifice justified by fear. This was exactly what her own tradition spoke against. She knew she couldn't interfere. Yet she also knew she couldn't look away. Tomorrow, the council would meet. Tomorrow, a decision would be made. Tomorrow, the ancient world would show its truest face, whether through mercy or through blood. Night fell over the village like a heavy cloak. The fires in the high place burned low, casting long tongues of orange across the ground. Most villagers had gone home, though no one truly slept. The threat of tomorrow sat on every doorstep like an unwelcome guest. Sarai stayed near the edge of the settlement, listening to the restless sounds of a people torn between devotion and fear. The wind carried murmurs from open windows, arguments inside homes, parents clutching their children, elders invoking memories of the past. She had seen many civilizations, many temples, many rites. But nothing stirred her spirit like this place tonight. The tension wasn't just religious. It was human. At the center of the village stood the council circle, 7 broad stones arranged in a ring, each marked with ancient carvings. The stones were older than anyone alive, perhaps older than the village itself. They had witnessed generations of triumphs, conflicts, droughts, and decisions that shaped the destiny of an entire people. Tonight, the stones would witness another. As the moon climbed into the sky, the council members arrived one by one. The chieftain came first, his face somber, his ash-painted symbol now smudged from sweat. Then came the elders, wrapped in woolen cloaks that fluttered in the night breeze. Amikar followed last, carrying a small clay lantern that flickered nervously in his hands. Sarai remained hidden among the shadows, close enough to hear, far enough to avoid being noticed. The chieftain raised a hand. "Let the council convene." Elder Namer immediately stepped forward, leaning heavily on his staff. "The signs are clear," he croaked. "The drought is not ordinary. It is punishment. It is neglect of the ancient ways. And only through the blood of the firstborn will balance return." Another elder, a broad woman named Lale, shook her head sharply. "We abandoned those rites generations ago," she said. "And the rains still came. The gods do not hunger for children." "You speak from weakness," Namer snapped. "From forgetfulness. Our ancestors understood that the gods demand sacrifice equal to the severity of the judgment. If the land is dying, then a life must be given." Amikar stepped forward, voice steady but eyes troubled. "Elder, the sacrifices we have offered were accepted." The fire answered. The smoke rose straight into the sky, a sign of favor. Namer's lips curled. Young priest, your generation has softened. You believe the gods are like men, satisfied with a goat when they desire a child. You believe devotion can be measured in handfuls of grain. A murmur rippled across the council. Sarai felt her pulse quicken. Lala lifted her chin. Let us speak plainly. You want us to choose a child. Whose child shall it be, Namer? Will you give your grandson? Silence. Namer's jaw tightened. The gods, he said quietly, will reveal the chosen. Lala scoffed, but the chieftain held out a hand to quiet them. This drought is killing us, he said. And our people look to us for answers. If we choose wrongly, we doom the village. If we choose cruelty, we doom our souls. His voice cracked slightly at the last word. Amikar stepped closer. There is another way. All eyes turned toward him. In the oldest traditions, he said carefully, the firstborn sacrifice was symbolic. A child passed near the fire, not into it. Dedicated, not killed. Marked, not slain. Namer struck his staff against the stones. Lies. Corruptions. The ancient texts demand life. The ancient texts are fragments, Amikar countered. Scraps. Interpretations. We do not know their original purpose. Then we return to the oldest memory, Namer snarled. And the oldest memory is blood. The air tightened like a drawn bow. Sarai felt her breath grow shallow. This was more than a theological argument. It was a battle between two visions of civilization, one rooted in fear-driven sacrifice, the other searching for meaning beyond cruelty. The chieftain looked at Amikar. You propose a symbolic rite? I propose preserving our children, Amikar said softly. Namer's eyes flashed with rage. You would defy the gods. Amikar met his stare. I would understand them. The council erupted in competing shouts until the chieftain raised both arms. We will vote, he said. Let the stones record our decision. 6 members. 3 elders, 2 priests, and the chieftain himself. Each stepped to one of the stones, placing a hand upon its surface. Left hand for symbolic offering. Right hand for blood sacrifice. Sarai held her breath. Lala placed her left hand. Another elder followed with his left. The younger priest placed his left. 3 votes for symbolism. Namer slammed his right hand onto the stone. Another elder hesitated, then placed his right. 2 votes for blood. Only the chieftain remained. He approached the stone slowly, the firelight flickering across his troubled face. His hand hovered, left, right, left again. His decision would define the village. Define their civilization. Define their legacy in history. At last, he placed his hand. Sarai exhaled sharply. Left. The symbolic rite was chosen. But just as relief broke through the tension, Namer spoke in a trembling, venomous whisper. You have condemned us all. The gods will not be mocked. He lifted his staff, and slammed it into the center stone. It cracked with a thunderous snap. Everyone froze. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog began to howl. Tomorrow, the ritual would proceed. But not everyone would accept the council's decision. And Sarai knew the true danger had only begun. The night after the council vote felt heavier than any before it. Even the wind seemed to avoid the village, leaving the air still and suffocating. Sarai remained awake long after the last torch died, listening for signs of unrest. She knew Elder Namer would not accept the council's decision. His fury wasn't the anger of a man contradicted, it was the fanaticism of someone who believed he alone carried the voice of the gods. And zealotry was far more dangerous than drought. Before dawn, distant footsteps stirred the silence. Sarai rose quickly and moved toward the sound, staying hidden between clay walls. The footsteps grew louder, hurried, unsteady. A figure rushed past her hiding place, cloak flapping like a tattered wing. Even in the dim light, she recognized the crooked silhouette. Namer. He was muttering to himself as he hobbled down the path leading away from the village, toward the high place of stones. Sarai's instincts urged her to follow. When she arrived, she found him kneeling at the cracked council stone, hands trembling over its fractured surface. The moonlight illuminated his face, twisted with grief and rage. "They do not see," he whispered, voice breaking. "They do not hear. They have forgotten the old covenant. They abandon the ancient ways, and they expect life." He struck the stone again with his staff, though it was now too weak to cause further damage. Sarai stepped back into shadow, heart pounding. This wasn't the behavior of a simple elder. This was the unraveling of a man who believed the world itself was slipping into chaos. Suddenly, Namer lifted his face toward the heavens. "If they will not give what is required," he hissed, "then I will." A chill ran down Sarai's spine. Namer pushed himself to his feet and turned toward the path leading back to the village, not the center, but the outer huts. The homes of the poorest families. Families with children. Sarai's breath caught. She moved before thinking, slipping through the shadows to intercept him, but staying hidden. She needed to know what he intended, but she could not risk being discovered. Namer approached one of the huts, murmuring prayers under his breath. "Firstborn, firstborn, the covenant must be sealed." Inside the hut, a baby cried. Sarai's stomach twisted. But just as Namer reached for the door, a new voice broke the silence. "Elder Namer. What are you doing?" Amikur stepped from the darkness, lantern in hand, expression tense but resolute. Namer froze. The old man's eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and contempt. "Young priest," Namer rasped, "you stand in the way of salvation." Amikur approached slowly. "No. I stand between you and a crime." "A crime?" Namer's voice rose. "You think obedience to the gods is a crime? The covenant is older than your grandfather's bones. We have abandoned it, and the drought is our punishment." "The council chose another path," Amikur said. "The council is blind." Namer thundered. "They've traded divine law for the comfort of mothers. They've traded sacrifice for softness." Amikur planted himself firmly between Namer and the hut. "No child will die tonight." The old man trembled with rage. "You idolize mercy and call it wisdom," he spat. "But mercy is weakness when the gods demand strength." Sarai held her breath. She sensed this was the moment the entire village's future hung upon. Namer drew back his staff, not to strike the hut, but Amikur. The young priest didn't move. "Do it," Amikur said quietly, "and you prove the gods you speak for are not gods of life, but of fear. And fear is not worthy of worship." Namer's eyes hardened. He swung. Sarai gasped. But Amikur raised his arm and blocked the blow with surprising skill. The lantern fell, extinguished. The two men struggled, shadows tangled in moonlight. Namer swung again, but Amikur grabbed the staff and pulled it from his grip. The old man collapsed to his knees, breath ragged. You are destroying us," Namer whispered. "You doom the village." Amikur stepped back, trembling, holding the staff like a venomous serpent he didn't want to touch. "The only doom," he said, "is spilling innocent blood." Namer lifted his face, streaked with tears and fury. "Then may the gods judge you." Amikur said nothing. He simply turned and walked away, taking the staff with him. Namer remained on his knees long after the priest disappeared, shoulders shaking with sobs of grief, rage, or both. Sarai slipped away unnoticed. She knew the crisis was far from over. The symbolic rite might proceed in the morning, but Namer's devotion was stronger than law. Stronger than reason. Stronger than his fear of the council. A man who believes he holds the will of the gods is not easily stopped. And Sarai feared the old ways were not finished with this village just yet. Dawn approached slowly, as if hesitant to rise over a village carrying such heavy tension. A pale blue light crept across the horizon, brushing the tops of the clay huts and spreading across the dusty ground. Roosters crowed half-heartedly, their calls subdued, as if they too sensed the uncertainty in the air. Sarai stepped from her shelter and looked toward the high place. A thin plume of smoke was already rising. The priests had begun preparations for the symbolic rite. It should have been a moment of relief for the village. A move away from the brutal rituals of the past. A turn toward a more humane understanding of devotion. But fear lingered like a shadow under every breath. Parents clutched their children closer than usual. Older villagers whispered to one another, casting suspicious glances at neighboring homes. Some believed the symbolic rite would anger the gods. Others believed it was the only path that would save them from becoming the kind of civilization future generations would condemn. Sarai knew both hopes and fears could drive a people to extremes. Amikar approached her, looking exhausted but resolute. His sleeve was torn where Namer's staff had struck him, a bruise had already begun to form. "You were watching," he said quietly, without accusation. "I had to understand," Sarai replied. He nodded. "And now you do." Sarai studied his face. "You protected that family last night. You protected their child." Amikar looked away. "I protected the village from crossing a line it may never return from. Once blood is spilled for ritual, it becomes easier to spill it again." Sarai thought of the many civilizations she had studied. Some had thrived through compassion and cooperation. Others had fallen to chaos fueled by superstition and fear. The line between the two often began with a single choice, a single sacrifice made in the name of necessity. "Will Namer accept the council's decision?" she asked. Amikar hesitated. "That man worships memory itself," he said. "He believes the gods speak to him alone. I fear he will not stop." Before Sarai could respond, the chieftain approached, accompanied by 2 guards. He greeted Sarai respectfully and turned to the priest. "Amikar, is the rite ready?" "Nearly," Amikar replied. "The symbolic passing through the fire will require a child of a willing family. One chosen, not taken." The chieftain exhaled heavily. "I have spoken with the families. They are afraid. But one has agreed, the family of Harel. Their eldest daughter, Nima, will participate." Sarai felt a bittersweet ache in her chest. A symbolic rite, yes, no bloodshed. But to offer a child, even symbolically, showed how powerful the weight of belief still was. "Will she be safe?" Sarai asked. "Yes," Amikar said firmly. "The flames will be low. No contact. Only the gesture of dedication." The chieftain nodded. "Then let us begin." By the time the villagers gathered at the high place, the sun had fully risen. The fire burned softly, like a warm breath instead of a roaring inferno. Drums beat slowly, rhythmic, steady, meant to calm rather than frighten. The elders formed a circle. The priests stood at their stations. The people waited in tense silence. Nima, a girl of about 10, approached the altar holding her mother's hand. Her dark hair was braided with simple cords, and her eyes were wide with both fear and pride. Sarai felt her heart tighten. How many children throughout history had stood before fires in rituals like this? How many had walked willingly, or unwillingly, into the hands of priests who believed they were acting for the good of the community? Today, at least, this child would not burn. Amikar stepped forward, lifting his arms. "People of the village," he called, voice strong but gentle. "Today we honor the gods not with death, but with life. Not with fear, but with hope. Let this child's steps through the smoke be a reminder that devotion does not demand blood." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. Sarai saw relief soften many faces. Nima's mother knelt, pressing her forehead to her daughter's. Then she let go. Nima stepped forward alone. The drums changed rhythm, a slow heartbeat echoing through the stones. Amikar guided her toward the low flame. Two priests lifted bowls of incense, casting fragrant smoke that curled around the child like thin white arms. Nima hesitated at the edge of the fire. Just one step was all that was required. One symbolic passage. Sarai watched closely, her breath held. Nima closed her eyes. Took a breath. And stepped forward. The flames surged lightly, brushing her shadow, but not touching her skin. She passed through safely, emerging on the other side to the sound of relieved sighs and whispers. It was done. The offering had been made, and no blood had been spilled. For a moment, the village felt united again. But unity never lasts long when fear still lives in the hearts of a few. At the edge of the crowd, a figure stood motionless. Hunched. Silent. Eyes blazing with betrayal. Elder Namer. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. His lips moved in silent fury. Sarai felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. Namer wasn't simply angry. He was planning. He believed the symbolic rite insulted the gods. He believed the drought would worsen now. He believed the council had abandoned divine law. And a man who believes the gods demand blood will find a way to spill it. The symbolic rite should have brought peace. For a few hours, it seemed to. People returned to their homes lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from their backs. Mothers hugged their children with renewed hope. Even the chieftain's face, normally carved from stern resolve, looked gentler as he walked back through the village. But peace rarely lasts long in a place where fear has already rooted itself deep. By midday, a faint tremor of unrest rippled through the settlement. Small things at first, 2 goats found dead near the riverbed, their bodies untouched but stiff, a sudden dust storm swirling without warning before breaking apart, a low rumble beneath the earth that some felt and others swore they imagined. To most villages, these would be strange but natural occurrences. To a village caught between old gods and new interpretations, they were signs. Sarai observed the subtle shift in the people's eyes. The shadows of doubt crept back in. Some whispered that the gods were displeased with the symbolic offering. Others whispered that Namer had cursed the ritual. The line between superstition and belief blurred quickly. Amikar tried to soothe their fears. It is the season of unsettled winds, he explained to a group of villagers gathered around him. Animals die. Dust rises. The earth shifts. These are not judgments, they are nature. But his words were swallowed by unease. People don't listen to explanations when terror offers a simpler answer. By late afternoon, rumors spread that Namer had gone to the cliffs alone after the rite. Some said he was fasting, others that he was calling upon the gods in secret. No one wanted to confront him. Not after last night. Not after seeing the fury in his eyes. Sarai knew she needed to speak with him, not to challenge, but to understand. Fanatics rarely acted alone, and the village was balanced on a knife's edge. She found him at dusk. Namer stood at the edge of the cliffs overlooking the dried river, arms stretched wide as if embracing the sky. The wind whipped his cloak around him, revealing a frail but determined figure. He didn't turn when Sarai approached. "I suppose you've come to tell me I am wrong," he said in a thin, cracked voice. "No," Sarai replied softly. "I've come to hear you." Namer lowered his arms slowly and turned to face her. His eyes were red, not from tears but from nights without rest. "They think me mad," he whispered. "They think I cling to shadows of past ages. But I remember what others choose to forget." He pointed toward the village far below them. "That land survives because our ancestors bled for it. They gave all they had, including the lives of their firstborn. They were strong. And the gods protected them." Sarai considered her words carefully. Strength is not measured by how much blood is spilled, she said. Sometimes it's measured by how much you protect. Namer's face twisted with frustration. You speak like the young priest. Soft. Idealistic. Blind. His voice sharpened. The drought is a warning. And your so-called symbolic right is an insult. A mockery. The people felt peace today, Sarai said. They felt hope. False hope. Namer snapped. The gods demand obedience, not comforting illusions. You outsiders, he paused, studying her more closely. You see us as primitives. But we understand things you cannot. We know the world is harsh. Cruel. And cruelty must be answered with devotion. Sarai stepped closer. I do not see you as primitive. I see you as a people trying to survive. But survival should not require the death of a child. His jaw tightened. The gods disagree. A long, heavy silence settled between them. Finally Sarai asked, "What are you planning, Namer?" His expression shifted, a flicker of something dangerous beneath the exhaustion. "What must be done," he murmured. "If the council will not act, then someone must." Sarai's heart clenched. Who, Namer? Who must be sacrificed? He didn't answer. Instead, he lifted his gaze to the reddening sky, where the sun set like a glowing ember sinking into ash. When night falls, he whispered, the gods will show their anger. And when they do, the village will know I spoke the truth. A gust of wind swept dust across the cliffs. Namer turned away and began walking back toward the village, slow, deliberate steps, like a man with grim purpose. Sarai watched him disappear into the fading light. She knew then, with certainty, that the symbolic rite had not ended the danger. It had ignited it. And whatever Namer intended to do next would bring the village face to face with the darkest part of its ancient heritage. The deeper we go into the world of ancient idol-worshipping cultures, the clearer one truth becomes: none of these societies practiced evil simply because they were primitive. They weren't foolish, mindless tribes lost in superstition. No, they were intelligent, organized, and frighteningly deliberate. Their darkness had a purpose. And that purpose was power. But here is the part often forgotten in modern pop history narratives. These civilizations did not commit horrors because they enjoyed cruelty. They did it because they believed blood, sex, and fear were currencies, real, powerful currencies, capable of influencing gods, spirits, and the unseen world. And the priests, kings, and ruling classes used those beliefs to maintain control. The spirit economy. To understand them, you must imagine a time when thunder was the voice of a deity. Sickness meant the gods were angry. A flood was a spiritual punishment. Famine meant the heavens had turned their face away. In such a world, people didn't think in moral categories like sin and virtue. They thought in transactions. If we give the gods what they want, they will give us what we want. This was the foundation of every idol-worshipping society from the Near East to Mesoamerica. But the tragic irony is that the gods they thought they were pleasing did not answer. Not because they weren't there, but because these rituals were never demanded by the true creator in the first place. When human life became a tool. How does a civilization reach the point where killing a person becomes acceptable, even honorable? One word: fear. Ancient priests convinced people that divine beings could be manipulated. But divine beings were portrayed as unstable, quick to anger, and easily offended. So communities lived in a state of constant anxiety. What if we don't give enough? What if the gods send a plague? What if the crops fail because of us? It didn't matter which culture you study, Canaanites, Phoenicians, Aztecs, Moabites, or Carthaginians, this emotional landscape was identical. And eventually, human life became a bargaining chip. A sacrifice to avert disaster. A political tool. A method of instilling fear. These societies slid down a slope where the unthinkable became routine. The priests and the kings. But here is the part textbooks rarely emphasize. The rulers benefited enormously. If the gods were angry, who could interpret their will? The priests. And who punished the population for offending the gods? The kings. Religion became a mechanism of power. If a king wanted to wage war, he claimed the gods demanded it. If a child was born with a deformity, priests said the gods required its sacrifice. If a village rebelled against authority, it was declared cursed. This monopoly on spiritual authority allowed elites to control resources, justify wars, crush dissent, and secure loyalty. The people weren't simply evil. They were trapped inside a system where fear and superstition dictated every choice. Why sex was sacred, but twisted. Another topic often misunderstood is the sexual rituals of ancient pagan societies. To modern ears, it sounds like pure corruption, temple prostitution, incest among royal families, orgiastic festivals. But to them, sexuality wasn't merely physical. It was cosmic. They believed the sexual act reenacted the creation of the world, strengthened the fertility of the land, pleased the gods of reproduction, and restored harmony with nature. But the result was a complete collapse of boundaries. Royal families often practiced incest to keep their bloodlines divine. Priests used ritual sex to channel spiritual energy. And entire communities participated in festivals where shame no longer existed. It wasn't pleasure for pleasure's sake. It was a religious duty. And that is what made it so dangerous. A society without limits. When a culture removes the idea of moral absolutes, when nothing is forbidden if the gods demand it, then anything becomes possible. Every horror becomes justifiable. A child could be burned alive for the harvest. A woman could be forced into ritual sex for the temple. A slave could be sacrificed for victory in war. A family could be executed for angering the gods. When morality is no longer grounded in anything objective, it becomes clay in the hands of those in power. And that is how these civilizations, brilliant, artistic, innovative, became capable of atrocities that shock us even today. Transition to the next part. But the question remains. Were all idol-worshipping civilizations like this? Were there exceptions? Did some cultures use idols symbolically rather than violently? The next part takes us deeper. We will explore the archaeological evidence, what was myth, what was exaggerated, and what was undeniably real. As we step deeper into the heart of ancient idolatry, one truth becomes unavoidable. Some gods were gentle, symbolic, and tied to nature, but others demanded blood. And those violent deities left marks on history so deep that even millennia later, we still feel their echo. But here is the part many people don't know. Not every culture sacrificed humans all the time. Some did it rarely. Some did it symbolically. And some, terrifyingly, built entire civilizations on the foundation of death. To understand why, we must look at the gods themselves. Moloch, the god of the fire. Perhaps the most infamous name among all ancient deities is Moloch. He appears in the records of multiple cultures. Canaanites, Phoenicians, Ammonites, and later Carthaginians. The rituals associated with this figure were brutal. According to both ancient writers and archaeological discoveries, worshippers would heat a metal idol to glowing red. Place infants or young children into its hands. Let them roll into the furnace beneath. Drown out the screams with drums and flutes. Some argue the scale has been exaggerated. But the evidence of cremated remains in sacred sites is difficult to dismiss. But here is the chilling part. These people didn't see it as murder. They saw it as an offering of their most precious gift, the life of their child, to secure blessings from the divine. In their worldview, giving up what meant most to you proved devotion. The temptation of extreme sacrifice. Why did people go along with this? One word: desperation. When famine struck, when the rains failed, when disease spread, people believed the gods were angry. A normal offering, a lamb, a bowl of grain, a calf, no longer felt enough. They needed something greater, something shocking, something that would surely grab the gods' attention. So rulers and priests declared, "Only the blood of the innocent can turn away the curse." And ordinary families obeyed, believing their sacrifice would save the community. This is the power of fear when it wears a religious mask. Aztec cosmology, a world built on sacrifice. The Aztec Empire often horrifies modern readers because of the sheer scale of ritual killing. But to them, sacrifice was not cruelty. It was a cosmic necessity. Their mythology taught that the sun needed nourishment. The gods expended their own blood to create the world. Humans must return that blood to keep the universe stable. In a strange, twisted logic, human sacrifice became an act of gratitude. During the festival of Tlaxcalquimico, victims were adorned in feathers and jewels, treated as divine figures, before being slain. In the ritual of Toxcatl, a chosen man lived an entire year as the embodiment of a god, granted honor and respect, before willingly offering himself to death. To us, it is tragic. To them, it was holy. The double life of priests. Priests in these societies often occupy a romantic place in modern imagination, wise, serene, mystical. But in reality, many were political figures wielding immense power. Their responsibilities included interpreting omens, deciding who lived or died, managing the calendar of sacrifices, selecting victims, keeping monarchs in check or supporting them. In some cultures, priests were feared more than the king. And the more gruesome the rituals, the stronger their control became. If your salvation depends on a priest's ritual, you do not question the priest. Was every pagan culture bloodthirsty? This is a myth created by centuries of storytelling. No, not every idol-worshipping society practiced such horrors. Some cultures used idols as symbols of nature, fertility, creativity, change of seasons. In many places, sacrifices were simple: bread, fruits, incense, flowers. But the difference is not the culture, it's the worldview. When gods are seen as unpredictable, emotional, vengeful, and hungry for attention, then rituals escalate to dangerous extremes. The slippery slope of spiritual power. Here lies the lesson that echoes through all ancient civilizations. Once a society believes the gods demand extreme actions, there is no natural limit. One generation sacrifices animals. The next sacrifices prisoners. The next sacrifices children. And the final stage is when rulers sacrifice their own people to keep their power. This is not fiction. This is history repeated across continents. And this is why ancient texts, including the Bible, warn so strongly against these practices. Not because other cultures were ignorant, but because idolatry often transformed morality into something unrecognizable. But there is still one more disturbing question left. Did these horrors happen only in religious rituals? Or did they spill into everyday life, changing family structures, relationships, laws, and the very fabric of society? The next chapter dives into how idolatry transformed not just temples, but households. When we imagine ancient idol worship, we often picture huge temples, loud festivals, and dramatic rituals. But the truth is much more intimate, and far more unsettling. Because idolatry was not just a ceremony. It was a daily lifestyle. It shaped families, decisions, relationships, fears, and every corner of ordinary life. Let's step inside a typical ancient home. The altar in the corner. Almost every household had a small altar. Sometimes it was a carved figurine. sometimes a bowl for offerings. Sometimes charms hanging from the ceiling or bones buried under the floor. People believed these idols controlled health, protection, fertility, success in work, and safety from evil spirits. Children watched their parents bow to these objects every morning and every night. To them, this was normal life. The gods were always watching, always demanding, always expecting something. Fear as a family routine. Every decision carried fear. Don't shout, the spirits will hear. Don't plant during this moon, you'll offend the goddess. Don't argue with the priest, he speaks for the gods. Fear became a tradition passed from parent to child. And when fear becomes tradition, true freedom disappears. When sex became religion, idolatry didn't stop at the front door. It entered the marriage bed. Many cultures believed sexuality was a spiritual act. So couples were ordered to perform certain rituals, sometimes even under a priest's supervision. In some regions, brides were required to offer themselves to a temple representative before joining their husbands. In others, ritual prostitution was considered holy service. And at the top of society, royal families practiced incest to protect their divine bloodlines. When spirituality loses boundaries, morality dissolves with it. Morality without limits. In these cultures, right and wrong were flexible. A man could accuse his neighbor of angering a god, just to steal his land. A woman who miscarried could be punished for displeasing a fertility deity. A child born with a disability might be abandoned as cursed. Your worth depended on how useful you were to the gods, or to the rulers who spoke in their name. Rituals inside the house. Archaeologists have uncovered unsettling evidence. Infants buried beneath doorways for good fortune. Small sacrifices during house construction. Offerings placed in rivers or crossroads. Animals killed to please local spirits. To us, these acts are horrifying. To them, they were simply part of life. The economy of magic. Idolatry also created a market of fear. People paid for charms, curses, blessings, love spells, healing rituals, and protection talismans. Fortune tellers, mediums, and magicians held real power, because everyone believed they could influence unseen forces. If you feared being cursed, you bought a charm. If you feared losing your crops, you offered a sacrifice. Fear kept the system alive. Children in the shadow of the gods. Children were the most vulnerable. They could be dedicated to temple service, offered in rituals, or punished for attracting evil. Parents weren't being cruel, they genuinely believed these actions protected their families. This is what happens when a society convinces itself that suffering is holy. The heart of the issue. The problem was never just the statues or symbols. The real danger was the worldview behind them. A worldview where gods demanded fear instead of love. Sacrifice instead of mercy. Obedience without compassion. And in such a world, the innocent always suffer first. But here's the strange part. Many of these civilizations were incredibly advanced. Powerful. Rich. Influential. So how did societies built on fear rise so high? It seems impossible, doesn't it? How could civilizations that practiced fear, blood sacrifice, and rigid obedience rise to such power, build empires, and leave a mark on history? Yet they did. And understanding why reveals the full paradox of ancient idol worship. Control through belief. The key was simple: control through belief. When people truly believed the gods could punish disobedience or bless devotion, their actions aligned with the ruler's goals. A priest could say, "The river will dry unless we sacrifice a child," and the community would comply without question. A king could claim divine mandate, and armies would march willingly. Fear became a tool, and belief became obedience. Fear as government. In modern terms, these societies were run like states of constant surveillance. Every action had spiritual consequences. Every failure, every mistake, could be interpreted as offense to a god. The ruling class, both secular and religious, held absolute authority because no one dared oppose divine will. But fear alone was not enough. It had to be reinforced with ritual, spectacle, and tradition. Rituals as societal glue. Public ceremonies, sacrifices, festivals, and temple rites, served a hidden function. They reinforced obedience, reminded citizens of divine power, and unified communities around shared fear. Even terrifying acts, like human sacrifice, became collective experiences, binding the people together under the same belief system. In effect, horror became a social adhesive. The duality of advancement. Here lies the paradox. While these civilizations were morally harsh, they were also technologically and culturally sophisticated. They built sprawling cities, advanced irrigation systems, monumental architecture, written language, trade networks, art and astronomy. The same system that used fear to control the population also incentivized innovation. Civilizations that could feed, protect, and organize people under belief grew stronger than those that could not. The risk of systemic fear. But the reliance on fear had limits. When a ruler or priest miscalculated, public resentment could erupt into rebellion. Crops could fail despite sacrifices. Droughts and epidemics could still strike. And when the gods did not respond as promised, trust eroded. The very system that granted power could also destroy it. This was the fragile paradox: fear gave control, but it demanded perfection to sustain it. The lesson for the future. For us, the story of these civilizations is a warning. Systems built on fear and rigid obedience may achieve short-term success, but they carry hidden dangers. Power without compassion leads to suffering, injustice, and, eventually, collapse. Even the mightiest empires cannot escape the consequences of moral corruption and exploitation of the innocent. The next step. The next chapter will explore a final, uncomfortable truth. Not all idol-worshipping societies were bloodthirsty, but those that were left marks on the world that echo even today. We will examine archaeological evidence, myth versus reality, and the lessons modern humanity can learn from the shadows of the past. By now, we've explored the dark heart of ancient idol worship, human sacrifices, fear, obedience, and power. But how much of what we know is fact, and how much is legend? Archaeology speaks. Excavations across the Middle East, Mesoamerica, and the Mediterranean have uncovered disturbing evidence. Bones of children buried under altars. Remnants of temples with signs of ritual killing. Inscriptions describing sacrifices to gods. Ceremonial objects used to invoke spirits. These findings confirm that human sacrifice was real. It was not just a myth created by later writers or enemies. The horror was factual. But archaeology also shows nuance. Not every society practiced it constantly, nor were all rituals deadly. Many cultures had symbolic ceremonies, offerings of food, animals, or symbolic bloodletting, meant to honor the gods without killing humans. This distinction matters, because it reminds us that idol worship was not monolithic. Myth versus reality. Ancient texts often exaggerate the cruelty of rival cultures. Writers used fear and moral outrage to justify conquest or warn their people. The Bible, Greek historians, and Roman accounts depict barbarism and grotesque rituals. But these accounts were sometimes amplified to make a point. Do not follow their ways. In reality, the truth is complex. Some practices were terrifying, others were symbolic, some were moral, some immoral, all viewed through the lens of the culture that practiced them. The human cost. Even when sacrifices were symbolic, fear ruled daily life. Children lived in households where the unseen could punish at any moment. Families made choices based on divine expectation. And the ruling class used these beliefs to enforce social order and political dominance. We must understand, the danger of these societies was not their technology or art. It was the worldview they created, a worldview where morality was conditional, and obedience to gods or rulers justified suffering. Art, culture, and innovation. Despite these horrors, ancient idol-worshipping societies produced remarkable achievements. Magnificent architecture, like ziggurats, pyramids, and temples. Sophisticated writing systems. Calendars, astronomy, and mathematics. Intricate art and storytelling. Law codes and trade networks. Fear and devotion drove not only cruelty but also organization, discipline, and creativity. The same systems that imposed terror also enabled greatness. The lesson for today. Studying these civilizations teaches us important lessons. Belief can be a tool for both progress and oppression. Fear can unite people, but it can also destroy innocence. Symbols and rituals carry power, but they must be guided by ethics, not coercion. Ignoring history's warnings risks repeating its mistakes. We may think ancient idol worship belongs only to the past, but in every era, humans create systems of belief that shape behavior. Understanding the extremes of history helps us recognize danger before it becomes reality. Looking ahead. The next chapter will examine the ultimate question. Could humans have survived in societies that demanded blood, fear, and rigid obedience? And what does that survival, or collapse, teach us about civilization, morality, and the choices that define us? Imagine living in a village where the gods watch every move. Where your worth depends on obedience. And where failing to please the divine could bring disaster. This was the reality for many ancient idol-worshipping civilizations. Survival was not guaranteed, and life was measured in fear, ritual, and devotion. The daily struggle. In such societies, each day began with careful attention to rules. Farmers observed the correct planting dates or risked famine. Parents offered prayers and small sacrifices for their children's safety. Families prepared food for the household altar before eating. Priests monitored omens and interpreted dreams, controlling both fate and resources. Even ordinary tasks required vigilance. One misstep could bring punishment from the unseen, or worse, disapproval from rulers claiming divine authority. The role of community. Despite fear, survival depended on cooperation. People helped one another because the gods demanded unity, or because communal life was necessary in harsh environments. Neighborhoods, clans, and extended families formed tight networks. Trust and collaboration were essential, even if always shadowed by anxiety. Innovation and control. Paradoxically, fear and ritual encouraged innovation. To survive, communities developed irrigation systems to ensure crops in dry seasons. Storage methods to prevent famine. Medicine, herbs, and early healing techniques. Trade networks to acquire what local resources lacked. Powerful rulers and priests organized labor and enforced discipline, but they also enabled these advancements. Control and survival were intertwined. The cost of obedience. Yet obedience came at a price. Children grew up learning to fear both gods and humans. Families made decisions based on superstition or the will of priests. Creativity was limited by the need to follow rituals. Questioning authority could mean exile, punishment, or death. And when sacrifices were demanded, the innocent often paid the highest price. Cultural resilience. Still, humans adapted. Many idol-worshipping societies survived for centuries, despite harsh practices. They learned which rituals were symbolic, which were required, and how to maintain stability in the face of uncertainty. The capacity to survive in such a system required intelligence, cunning, and courage. It also required a certain acceptance of fear as part of daily life. The lesson for modern humans. Looking back, we see that morality and survival can conflict. Power, belief, and fear can create both greatness and cruelty. Studying these societies reminds us how fragile human ethics can be under pressure. It also teaches us resilience, that even in a world dominated by fear, humans find ways to endure. The next chapter will explore the final, most troubling question. How much of the horror we read about was real, and how much was exaggerated? And what can archaeology tell us about the daily lives of those who lived under the shadows of the gods? We have seen the dark side of ancient idol worship, sacrifices, fear, and strict obedience. But separating fact from fiction is not easy. Many ancient stories were written by outsiders, by conquerors, or by later generations who wanted to warn against these practices. So, how much of it was real? How much was exaggerated? Archaeological evidence. Excavations across the Middle East, Central America, and the Mediterranean provide hard evidence. Bones of children and animals buried under temple floors. Ceremonial objects stained with signs of ritual use. Inscriptions describing offerings to gods. Large altars designed for public sacrifices. These discoveries confirm that human sacrifice was real in some societies. It was not merely a story made up by enemies or moralists. When stories exaggerate. At the same time, ancient texts often amplified events. Writers wanted to frighten, to shock, or to justify political or religious action. The Bible, Greek historians, and Roman authors describe grotesque rituals that may have occurred, but not always at the scale described. Some scholars argue that reports of entire cities sacrificing thousands of people are likely exaggerations. Yet, even if numbers were inflated, the principle remains: fear, obedience, and blood sacrifices shaped many societies. Symbolic rituals. Not all idol worship required death. Some cultures performed symbolic ceremonies. Offering food, grain, or flowers. Using figurines instead of humans. Bloodletting animals instead of people. These acts still expressed devotion, but did not take lives. It is important to remember this distinction. Idolatry was diverse. It could be terrifying, or mostly symbolic. The daily life of the ancients. Archaeology also reveals the smaller details of life. Houses with altars in the corners. Charms and amulets worn by children. Public spaces for festivals and gatherings. Communal kitchens and storage rooms. Even in societies that practiced human sacrifice, ordinary life continued. People farmed, traded, celebrated weddings, and told stories. Fear was part of life, but it did not define every moment. What we learn. Studying the evidence teaches us that ancient idol worship was complex. Sacrifice and fear were part of life, but not universal. Daily rituals shaped communities and families. The stories we hear are a mix of fact, exaggeration, and interpretation. By understanding archaeology alongside historical texts, we get a fuller picture. We see not just horror, but also resilience, adaptation, and human ingenuity. Looking forward. Next, we will examine the moral lessons of these societies. Not just the rituals, the sacrifices, or the fear. But the choices these cultures made, and what modern humans can learn from them. Because history is not just about events. It is about understanding the decisions that led to suffering or survival. Having explored the rituals, sacrifices, and daily life of ancient idol-worshipping societies, we arrive at an important question. What can we learn from them? The stories are horrifying at times. Human lives were offered to gods. Fear ruled households. Morality was often flexible, bending to the demands of rulers and priests. But these civilizations also teach us lessons that are just as important as their darkness. 1. Fear is powerful, but dangerous. When fear dominates a society, obedience becomes automatic. People do what they are told, not because it is right, but because it seems necessary for survival. Leaders and priests could control entire communities through fear. This worked, for a time. But systems built on fear are fragile. If the gods do not answer, if crops fail, or if people begin to question authority, the system collapses. Fear can enforce obedience, but it can also destroy trust, community, and life itself. 2. Symbols shape behavior. Statues, altars, and rituals were more than decoration. They shaped behavior, controlled social norms, and reinforced hierarchy. Even when no human life was taken, these symbols reminded people who held power and what was expected. Belief gives influence. Symbols give structure. Together, they shape society. 3. Resilience and adaptation. Ancient people were not helpless victims. They adapted to harsh environments, unpredictable weather, and rigid religious systems. They innovated irrigation, storage, trade, and law systems. They survived centuries despite fear, sacrifice, and obedience. Resilience was key. Survival required intelligence, courage, and cooperation. 4. Ethics matter. The most important lesson: morality cannot be discarded. Societies that justify cruelty in the name of gods or rulers risk long-term collapse. Blood and fear may maintain order temporarily. But compassion, justice, and respect for life are essential for enduring civilizations. History shows us that ignoring ethics leads to suffering, rebellion, and eventually, ruin. 5. Understanding, not judging. It's easy to condemn these societies as barbaric. But they lived in worlds we can barely imagine. Nature was harsh, famine and disease were common, and survival was uncertain. Their choices were shaped by the worldview they inherited. By understanding them, we gain perspective, not only on the past, but on human nature itself. The final reflection. The ancient idol-worshipping world was complex. Some rituals were symbolic, some deadly. Some gods demanded obedience, some offered guidance. Fear, devotion, and power intertwined. Communities survived, thrived, or collapsed under these forces. We see both the darkness and the brilliance of humanity. We see the extremes of belief, what devotion can inspire, and what fear can demand. And we are reminded that the lessons of the past are not just stories. They are warnings for the present and guidance for the future. As we continue our journey through ancient idol-worshipping societies, one truth becomes painfully clear. Belief has a cost. Not all sacrifices were literal, but the weight of devotion affected every aspect of life. Families lived in constant vigilance. Children were taught fear as a tool for survival. Communities organized their entire lives around rituals, festivals, and ceremonies. Even when no blood was shed, the cost was psychological. Every choice was measured against divine expectation. Every failure could bring punishment or shame. The gods, or those claiming to speak for them, dictated morality, law, and social order. The cost of obedience. Obedience maintained society, but it came with consequences. Individuals lost autonomy over daily decisions. Families sometimes sacrificed members to appease perceived divine will. Creativity and dissent were stifled, limited by fear of reprisal. Children internalized anxiety, growing up believing that misfortune was always their fault. In this environment, survival required careful navigation between tradition, ritual, and personal conscience. Even the bravest risked punishment for questioning authority. The cost of power. For rulers and priests, control meant both influence and responsibility. Those who commanded devotion had the power to shape communities, economies, and culture. But they also bore the burden of maintaining rituals, enforcing obedience, and deciding who lived or died. Power in these societies was inseparable from spiritual authority. Those who misused it risked revolt. Those who failed to satisfy the people's fears risked chaos. The line between divine mandate and human cruelty was thin. Lessons in survival. Despite this harshness, humanity endured. People adapted to the demands of belief, finding ways to live meaningful lives within rigid systems. They formed strong family bonds, developed practical skills, and innovated in agriculture, trade, and art. Even in fear, life found a way. This resilience teaches a timeless lesson. Humans can survive extreme systems of belief, but only by understanding limits and navigating carefully. Reflecting on history. Looking at these civilizations today, it's tempting to focus solely on horror. The sacrifices. The fear. The obedience imposed by priests and rulers. But a full view shows more than cruelty. It shows human ingenuity, adaptation, and the ways people found meaning in a challenging world. It reminds us that belief itself is neither inherently good nor evil. Its consequences depend on how humans wield it. The next part will explore a final question. How these practices influence the moral codes recorded in sacred texts, like the Bible, and what warnings they offer modern societies. We will examine the connections between fear, devotion, and law, and how humanity learned to balance belief with ethics. As we move toward the conclusion of our journey, we face a key question. What did humanity learn from idol-worshipping civilizations? Not just about rituals or sacrifices, but about morality, society, and the choices that define us. The origin of ethics. Many scholars argue that the moral codes in sacred texts, like the Bible, arose partly in reaction to idol worship. The stories of Canaanites, Phoenicians, and other pagan cultures warn against child sacrifice, sexual immorality used as ritual, theft, murder, and lawlessness, fear-driven obedience. These texts emphasize that ethics must come from principles, not superstition. Morality cannot be dictated by whichever deity is believed to demand the most extreme actions. Fear versus love. Ancient idol worship often relied on fear. Fear of punishment, fear of famine, fear of angered gods. Fear ruled daily life and shaped decisions. The moral lessons of later sacred texts emphasize love, justice, and mercy instead. They stress that obedience should not be rooted in terror, but in understanding and compassion. This shift represents one of the greatest lessons humanity learned from the dark extremes of belief. Human sacrifice as warning. The accounts of human sacrifice are horrifying, but they serve a purpose. They remind us of what happens when morality is subservient to power. When rulers or priests justify cruelty in the name of gods, society suffers. When belief becomes a tool of oppression, innocence pays the highest price. History preserved these warnings so that future generations could recognize the danger and choose differently. The balance of belief. Belief itself is not inherently wrong. Idols, symbols, and rituals can inspire creativity, community, and order. But without moral grounding, belief can become destructive. The challenge for humanity has always been this balance. How to honor the divine, or the unseen, without losing humanity in the process. The modern connection. Even today, we see echoes of these lessons. Societies that rely on fear for control risk oppression. Systems without ethical limits can harm the innocent. Symbols and rituals shape behavior, for better or worse. Power must be exercised responsibly, not enforced through terror. Ancient civilizations were not merely primitive or cruel, they were human experiments in fear, belief, and survival. Studying them teaches us not just about history, but about the ethical choices we face today. The next chapter will explore the psychological impact of idol worship on individuals and communities. We will see how fear, ritual, and obedience shaped not only societies, but also the human mind, and why understanding this is vital for anyone who seeks to learn from history. As we continue, we must look beyond rituals and sacrifices. We need to understand how ancient idol worship shaped the human mind. Fear and devotion did more than control societies. They affected the way people thought, felt, and made decisions. Fear as a daily companion. In idol-worshipping civilizations, fear was constant. Fear of offending the gods. Fear of punishment from priests or rulers. Fear that failure would bring disaster to one's family. Children learned fear from birth. Every action, even ordinary chores, was measured against divine expectation. This created a society in which anxiety was normal and obedience automatic. Obedience and social control. Psychologists today recognize the effects of such fear-based systems. When individuals believe consequences are inevitable, they comply. When obedience is tied to spiritual reward or punishment, people internalize rules deeply. This made fear a powerful social tool, but also a personal burden. Rituals as psychological structure. Rituals, daily prayers, offerings, sacrifices, served a second purpose. They gave people structure in an unpredictable world. Sacrifices reassured them that they had done enough to appease the gods. Temples and altars created a sense of order. Festivals allowed communities to release tension collectively. Even terrifying rituals had a psychological function. They turned chaos into predictable patterns, giving people a feeling of control. The duality of faith. Belief in gods brought comfort and fear simultaneously. Faith promised protection, but also demanded obedience. Love and hope were intertwined with dread. This duality shaped not only culture, but the human mind. Long-term effects on society. The psychological impact went beyond the individual. Communities remained disciplined and united. Leaders maintained authority with minimal force. Social norms were reinforced without constant physical punishment. But there was a cost. Anxiety and stress were widespread. Questioning authority became dangerous. Innovation and creativity were limited by fear of divine or societal disapproval. Lessons for modern humans. By studying the psychology of ancient idol worship, we learn. Belief shapes thought and behavior profoundly. Fear can enforce obedience, but at the cost of mental health and freedom. Rituals can provide structure, but also control. Ethical grounding is essential to prevent abuse of power. Understanding these patterns helps us recognize how belief can be used or misused in any society. Next, we will explore the influence of idol worship on family life and social relationships. How did fear and devotion affect love, marriage, and community bonds? And what can that teach us about the human experience across time? So far, we have explored temples, sacrifices, fear, and the psychology of belief. Now we turn to the home, the most intimate place where idol worship affected human life. Ancient idol worship was not confined to public ceremonies. It entered the heart of families, shaping relationships, love, and social bonds. The altar in every home. Most households had an altar or sacred corner. It reminded everyone, children, parents, and elders, that divine eyes were always watching. Daily life revolved around offerings, prayers, and rituals. Children learned to bow before statues. Meals were shared with offerings to gods. Special days required additional sacrifices or ceremonies. The gods were part of family life, and their demands shaped behavior, sometimes more than love or personal choice. Love under the eye of the gods. Marriage and sexuality were often intertwined with devotion. Couples might perform rituals to ensure fertility. Some societies required supervised sexual rites, symbolic or real. Royal families sometimes practiced incest to preserve divine bloodlines. Even private relationships were influenced by religious expectation. Love could not exist outside the framework of divine approval. Parental fear and childhood. Children bore the heaviest psychological weight. They were taught fear as protection. Their actions could be interpreted as pleasing or offending the gods. Some were dedicated to temples, trained as servants, or even prepared as sacrifices. Parents acted out of belief, thinking obedience or sacrifice protected their children. Yet this created homes where fear often overshadowed joy. Community and social bonds. Despite the strict rules, families were part of larger networks. Neighborhoods observed collective rituals. Festivals united communities in shared devotion. Mutual support was essential, because survival often depended on cooperation. Fear and devotion were pervasive, but they also created structure, order, and cohesion. Ethical tensions. Idolatry often placed morality in conflict with devotion. Obedience might demand cruelty. Loyalty to gods could override personal conscience. Social norms sometimes justified acts we now consider horrific. This tension was a defining feature of ancient societies. Devotion and love existed, but they were always measured against divine expectation. Lessons for modern humanity. Studying family life under idol worship shows us. Belief can influence the most personal aspects of life. Fear shapes behavior more than affection in certain systems. Rituals and social expectations can unite communities but restrict individuality. Ethical grounding is vital to maintain love, respect, and human dignity. Families were both resilient and vulnerable, navigating survival, devotion, and morality every day. The next chapter will examine the extremes of human behavior under idol worship. We will explore how fear, devotion, and the demands of the gods sometimes led to acts of cruelty, and what that reveals about human nature itself. Having explored family life and the influence of idol worship on love and social bonds, we now turn to its darker consequences. In many ancient societies, fear of the gods and obedience to priests or rulers drove people to extremes. Actions that today seem unimaginable were once part of ordinary life. Human sacrifice and ritual violence. Archaeological evidence shows that human sacrifice occurred in multiple regions. Children and infants buried under altars for good fortune. Animals or even adults killed in ceremonies to appease deities. Blood offerings meant to protect crops, cities, or families. To us, these acts are horrifying. To ancient people, they were obligations, acts of devotion or survival. Sacrifice was not always constant, but it was real enough to shape society. Sexuality and power. Rituals also affected sexual behavior. Ritualized sexual acts were sometimes part of religious ceremonies. Royal families practiced incest, believing their bloodline was sacred. Temples sometimes required symbolic or actual sexual offerings. Religious devotion intertwined with power, status, and survival, creating behaviors that blurred morality. Theft, deception, and lawlessness. Without universal ethical standards, societies often allowed or even encouraged acts we consider criminal. Theft could be justified if done to honor a deity. Lies or deception were tools to protect oneself from divine punishment. Murder could be rationalized as service to gods or rulers. Obedience to the divine often took precedence over human law, creating a world where morality was flexible and fear-driven. The role of fear. Fear was the ultimate enforcer. People complied with extreme demands because they feared wrath. Children and adults alike internalized rules through anxiety. Priests and rulers maintained control with minimal physical coercion, relying on belief instead. Fear made obedience automatic, but it also made society fragile. One misinterpreted sign, one unfulfilled ritual, could spark crisis or rebellion. Creativity and resilience amid fear. Despite these extremes, humans were resilient. They farmed, traded, and built infrastructure. They created art, music, and literature. They maintained social bonds, even under stress. Fear and devotion shaped their world, but ingenuity and adaptation allowed them to survive. Humanity endured, even thrived, in conditions that seem brutal to modern eyes. Lessons for modern humans. The extremes of ancient behavior teach us. Belief can drive people to extraordinary devotion or cruelty. Systems built on fear produce obedience, but also suffering. Ethics must guide power, or morality will bend to expediency. Humans are adaptable and resilient, even in harsh systems. By understanding these extremes, we gain insight into both history and human nature. We learn why ancient societies warned others not to follow the same path, and why ethical grounding is essential for civilization. Next, we will examine how idol worship influenced entire civilizations, shaping laws, culture, and survival strategies, and what lessons that holds for modern humanity. We have explored families, fear, and the extremes of human behavior under idol worship. Now we step back to look at entire civilizations and how these beliefs shaped society, law, and culture. The foundation of power. In many ancient societies, religion and governance were inseparable. Rulers claimed divine authority, and priests interpreted the will of the gods. This created a system where obedience was tied to spiritual reward or punishment. Law was reinforced by fear of divine retribution. Communities were organized around rituals and festivals. Civilizations became structured, disciplined, and surprisingly stable, all because belief was woven into every level of society. Social order and control. Idol worship provided a framework for social order. People understood their roles and responsibilities. Hierarchies were justified by divine mandate. Justice systems often combined human law with religious obligation. Fear of divine wrath and communal pressure maintained compliance without the constant need for force. Civilizations flourished in part because their citizens internalized rules and rituals. Economy and trade. Religion also influenced the economy. Temples acted as centers of wealth, storage, and redistribution. Pilgrimages and festivals created markets and trade opportunities. Artisans, merchants, and farmers all operated within a system influenced by devotion. Even acts of commerce and production were connected to spiritual expectation. Belief became a driver of organization, innovation, and cooperation. Culture and art. Idol worship inspired creativity. Monumental architecture, like pyramids and ziggurats. Detailed sculptures and figurines. Religious music, poetry, and storytelling. These creations were both offerings to the gods and demonstrations of human ingenuity. Faith, even when fear-driven, could produce beauty and legacy. The cost of belief. Yet the system had a price. Individual freedom was limited. Morality could be compromised for divine favor. Fear governed both daily life and major decisions. The innocent sometimes suffered the most. Civilizations thrived, but their stability depended on obedience, fear, and ritual. Any lapse in belief or ritual could destabilize society, leading to crisis or collapse. Lessons for modern humanity. Studying these civilizations shows that belief shapes society, law, and culture profoundly. Systems built on fear can create order but also oppression. Devotion can drive innovation, art, and social cohesion. Ethical grounding is essential to prevent suffering and maintain human dignity. History teaches that the success of a civilization is not measured only by power or wealth, but by how it balances belief with ethics. The next chapter will explore the final reflection. The enduring impact of idol worship on modern ethics, morality, and our understanding of human nature. We will see how ancient lessons still resonate in our world today. As we approach the conclusion of our journey, it is clear that idol-worshipping societies left more than ruins, bones, and stories. They left lessons, some horrifying, some illuminating, that continue to resonate today. Influence on morality. One of the most significant impacts of ancient idol worship was on moral thought. Sacred texts, like the Bible, were shaped in response to practices considered extreme or immoral. Ethical codes emerged to prevent cruelty and protect the innocent. Laws emphasized justice, mercy, and human dignity over blind obedience to fear. In essence, humanity learned from the extremes. Fear, sacrifice, and coercion highlighted the need for morality and compassion. The lessons of fear. Fear was the primary tool of control in idol-worshipping societies. It taught obedience and shaped behavior, but it also left trauma. Children grew up anxious, internalizing divine and social expectations. Communities were disciplined, yet fragile, because fear alone could not sustain long-term loyalty. Leaders and priests wielded power through belief rather than force. Modern society can see echoes of this. Fear-based control may still influence politics, religion, and social systems. Recognizing it helps prevent abuse and protect human dignity. Culture, art, and innovation. Despite its darker side, idol worship inspired creativity. Architecture, sculpture, and art flourished. Rituals created rhythm and structure in daily life. Trade, agriculture, and governance were organized around shared belief. Fear and devotion drove both survival and progress. Even in extreme circumstances, humans found ways to create, innovate, and endure. The duality of human nature. Studying these civilizations shows the duality of humanity. Capacity for devotion and creativity. Capacity for cruelty and suffering. Capacity for resilience and adaptation. Idol worship amplified both extremes, teaching us that belief, when unchecked by ethics, can be dangerous, but when guided by morality, it can inspire growth. Modern reflection. Today, we can apply these lessons. Question systems of fear-based control. Ensure ethical principles guide devotion and obedience. Understand how belief shapes behavior, culture, and society. Protect the vulnerable from the consequences of extreme adherence to tradition. History is not just a record of events, it is a mirror. It shows what humans are capable of, both the horrors and the achievements, and reminds us to choose wisely. Looking ahead. The final chapter will reflect on survival, ethics, and the choices that define human civilization. It will bring together all the lessons learned from fear, devotion, family, society, and morality, to understand not just the past, but the enduring path of humanity. As we reach the penultimate stages of our journey, it is time to reflect on survival in ancient idol-worshipping civilizations. These societies were often harsh, demanding obedience, ritual, and sometimes sacrifice. Yet humans endured, and in enduring, they reveal powerful lessons about ethics, resilience, and the choices that define civilization. Survival under fear. Daily life was guided by fear. Fear of angering the gods. Fear of punishment from priests or rulers. Fear that failure would bring famine, disease, or social disgrace. People survived by understanding the rules, anticipating consequences, and cooperating with their community. Even children learned early that their actions had weight beyond the personal, the spiritual and societal expectations shaped every decision. Adaptation and resilience. Humans are remarkably adaptable. Even under strict religious systems. Farmers optimized crops based on seasonal rituals. Artisans created goods and religious artifacts to satisfy the demands of belief. Communities organized labor, trade, and festivals to maintain order. Survival required intelligence, skill, and social cooperation. Fear structured society, but ingenuity and adaptation ensured life continued. Ethics under pressure. Yet survival was not enough. Living under fear forced individuals and societies to confront ethical dilemmas. When obedience required cruelty, what should one do? How to protect loved ones without violating moral conscience? When does devotion cross into oppression? These questions were central to the development of ethical thought in later civilizations. Religious and legal codes evolved, emphasizing protection of the vulnerable and the importance of moral restraint. The cost of survival. Survival came at a price. Personal autonomy was limited. Innocents sometimes suffered for communal or divine demands. Creativity could be constrained by fear of disapproval. Yet humanity endured. People found ways to love, to create, and to build societies, even under oppressive belief systems. Modern lessons. Studying survival in these societies teaches us enduring truths. Ethics cannot be ignored, even under pressure. Fear can enforce order, but over time it creates fragility. Resilience and adaptation are essential for any civilization. The balance between devotion and morality defines sustainable societies. Ancient idol worship reminds us that power without ethics is dangerous. But resilience guided by morality can sustain humanity even in the harshest circumstances. Next, we will explore how these lessons culminate in the formation of moral systems, societal laws, and enduring human values, the ultimate inheritance from idol-worshipping civilizations. After examining survival under fear and devotion, we arrive at a pivotal insight. Ancient idol-worshipping civilizations shaped not just rituals, but the moral framework of humanity. From fear to ethics. Many ancient societies relied on fear to enforce obedience. People followed rules because disobedience could mean punishment by gods or rulers. But fear alone was insufficient for lasting social cohesion. Over time, humans realized that ethical principles must guide behavior, not terror. Sacred texts and legal codes evolved, emphasizing protection of the innocent, justice over arbitrary punishment, limits on cruelty, duties toward family, neighbors, and society. These principles emerged as a response to extremes observed in idol-worshipping societies. The origins of law. In civilizations influenced by idol worship, law and religion were intertwined. Temples acted as centers of justice. Priests interpreted divine will to govern social behavior. Rituals reinforced societal norms. As humans reflected on the consequences of extreme obedience and sacrifice, codified laws emerged to balance devotion with morality. The aim: ensure survival, order, and ethical treatment of all citizens. Values that endured. Some human values can be traced to lessons learned from idol worship. Compassion, protecting life, even when belief demands obedience. Justice, ensuring fairness, rather than following fear-driven commands. Responsibility, understanding that power, whether divine or human, carries consequences. Resilience, adapting creatively to challenges without compromising ethics. These values were essential for civilizations to thrive beyond fear-driven systems. The lesson for modern society. Even today, we see echoes of these ancient lessons. Ethical systems guide governments, communities, and families. Laws are influenced by centuries of human experience balancing belief and morality. Education, religion, and social structures emphasize responsibility, compassion, and justice. Studying idol-worshipping societies reveals that morality is learned through reflection on both achievements and horrors. It is humanity's response to the extremes of fear, devotion, and power. The human story. Ultimately, the story of idol-worshipping civilizations is a story of humanity. The capacity for creativity and cruelty. The struggle to survive under pressure. The emergence of morality from fear. The pursuit of order, justice, and compassion. These societies remind us that human values are not innate, but shaped by experience, observation, and reflection. Next, we will explore the final reflections. How ancient practices, rituals, and extremes influenced modern thought, and what enduring warnings they offer for humanity's future. We have journeyed through temples, rituals, sacrifices, fear, and devotion. We have explored families, communities, and civilizations shaped by idol worship. Now, we arrive at the final reflection. What these ancient worlds teach us about humanity, morality, and the future. The duality of humanity. Ancient idol-worshipping societies reveal a paradox. Humans are capable of horrific cruelty when fear or belief is misused. Humans are also capable of incredible creativity, resilience, and cooperation, even under pressure. The same systems that demanded obedience could inspire art, architecture, law, and cultural advancement. This duality reminds us that belief amplifies both the best and worst in human nature. Ethics as the ultimate lesson. One enduring lesson is clear. Morality cannot be sacrificed for obedience or fear. The horrors of human sacrifice, ritualized cruelty, and extreme devotion are warnings. Ancient texts, laws, and moral codes emerged to limit fear-driven behavior and protect the vulnerable. Ethics provide the foundation for lasting civilization, ensuring that survival does not come at the expense of humanity. The power and danger of belief. Belief is neither inherently good nor evil. It shapes societies, influences behavior, and structures life itself. But without ethical grounding, power can become oppressive. Fear can dominate thought. Communities can thrive at the cost of innocence. Understanding this balance helps modern humans navigate systems of authority, tradition, and ideology. The resilience of humanity. Despite extremes of devotion and fear, people endured. They adapted to harsh environments. They innovated to survive and prosper. They created culture, law, and civilization. Resilience is humanity's hallmark. Even under pressure, humans find ways to live, love, and endure. Looking to the future. Ancient idol-worshipping societies are not just history. They are mirrors for modern humanity. A warning against fear-driven obedience. A guide to ethical decision-making. A testament to human creativity and resilience. By studying their successes and failures, we learn how to balance belief, morality, and survival in our own world. History shows that fear can control, but ethics must guide. Devotion can inspire, but morality must anchor. Ritual can organize, but humanity must remain at the center. The ancient world, with all its darkness and brilliance, reminds us. The choices we make define civilization, and the legacy we leave for future generations.